Okay, hello and welcome back for part two of the Distinguished Man of Science of Great Britain, 1808, 1807 to 1808. In part two, we're going to look at English botanist Joseph Banks, scientific rock star at the turn of the century, 1800s, Humphry Davy, two Scottish civil engineers extraordinaire, Thomas Telford, John Rennie, and actually one of my favourites from this particular part or episode is actually Cornishman Richard Trevithick. So I've made this is like my third or fourth attempt now to actually pay homage to these fellas without actually droning on and on and on about it, because I'm going way over my 15-minute limit on my video, so I'm going to try and make things brief. So as I said, we're going to start off with Joseph Banks. Joseph Banks actually trained as a botanist. He actually raised to prominence when he returned from the 3-year voyage that departed England 1768 with no less than Thomas Cook at the helm. Or sorry, James Cook. Thomas Cook. No, the checks. James Cook at the helm. So the whole point of the voyage, as far as Joseph Banks was concerned, was actually to collect specimens with respect to fish, plants, animals. It was really a commercial endeavor to see what it could bring back to England and what they could exploit, of course, for commercial purposes in order to enrich the British Treasury, of course, right? So let me go back. So again, we're talking about Banks here, looking rather regal with his sash and his medallion on the breast of his coat there. So the voyage actually took them through the South Pacific. Of course, we're talking about they went around the tail of South America, up to Fiji, around New Zealand, Australia, up through New Guinea, Indonesia, back finally returning to England, of course, around the Cape of South Africa. So it took 3 years. That voyage actually killed a number of the crew members, as you can imagine. The disease, the actual just sheer danger of the voyage itself, and of course the attrition that would transpire over a 3-year window anyway in that particular day and age. So when he returned, he was an absolute hero to Victorian England. He was actually the head of the Royal Botanical Gardens at the age of 30 years of age, sorry. And he was the president of the Royal Society between 1778 and 1820. So quite a tenure there. After this image is theoretically from 1807 to 1808. And so he would die actually some 12 years after the theoretical date of this image. Speaking of this image itself, I read a quote or heard a quote from Stephen Hawking, and I thought he had a brilliant quote, which he to paraphrase him, he said basically the men in this image were the veins that were fueling the powerhouse of Victorian England. And I thought, wow, what a brilliant statement. So so that's Joseph Banks right there. Just sitting, just above Edward Jenner there, that we discussed in the last episode, if you recall. So moving on, I try and keep it brief. Humphry Davy. Now here's Humphry Davy here. Humphry Davy actually was trained as a chemist. He worked as youth in a pharmacy. He became a chemist, and he actually raised to prominence in the early 1800s thanks to his work in electrolysis. Lucky for Humphry Davy, right around 1799, 1800 itself, Alessandro Volta, the Italian, actually developed the voltaic pile and actually gave Humphry Davy a reliable source of electricity, which opened up, of course, a new and completely new scientific realm for him to actually work in. So Humphry Davy was extremely popular in the day because in Victorian England, public lectures on the subject of scientific experimentation, scientific findings of the day was actually extremely popular. And one of the people sitting in the audience I remember reading about was actually Mary Shelley, who of course would go on some years later to write Frankenstein. So I think it's quite easy to connect the dots, how you can see how he would have an influence on people. So just flipping through my notes here, Humphry Davy, just to give you an idea of what he was actually associated with. Humphry Davy is actually responsible in whole or in part for the discovery of the following elements. He separated the compounds using electrolysis, as I mentioned there, and he actually is associated with the discoveries of no less than potassium, sodium, calcium, strontium, barium, magnesium, and of course the gas that would go on to be the horror of the world of World War I and many years to follow, chlorine. As well as actually sanitizing a good part of the world's water supply. So it's not all bad with respect to chlorine, of course. But he did actually damage his health working with doing his experimentation, and he'd actually intentionally expose himself to a lot of these gases. As you can imagine, a lot of this kind of stuff was done back in the day. So it wasn't a real big surprise that he would die at a fairly early age. He was only 51 when he actually died. So that is Humphry Davy. Humphry Davy right there. So just panning across here, we can catch two of these guys, and in the interest of expediency, I'll actually discuss both of these fellas at the same time. So this is Thomas Telford, and I wasn't familiar with either one of these guys. This is Thomas Telford, and that's John Rennie. And both of these fellas are actually absolute Scottish civil engineers extraordinaire. Both of them would have a lifelong career of building roads, bridges, canals that can be found all over Britain, right from the south of England up to in Wales, all the way up to northern Scotland and the Highlands of Scotland. Bridges, canals, docks, including for Thomas Telford anyway, including canal. An aqueduct, a navigable aqueduct that actually crosses the River Dee some 40 meters above the actual river itself. I mean, think about that. An engineering project where you have a canal that actually crosses a river without an exchange in water. That's pretty mind-blowing, and that kind of project didn't seem to daunt them back in the day. So that's Thomas Telford. And John Rennie, famous for his bridges, especially. And he actually designed no less than 3 bridges that was actually across the Thames River at various points throughout history. He'd go on to have 2 sons that were actually famous engineers themselves. So John Rennie actually, just a sidebar note, John Rennie actually worked for John Watt for some time, from what I've read, and he actually was instrumental in pushing forward the Bolton and Watt company itself with some of his innovations before he would go on to focus his energies on civil engineering. So speaking of engineers, we'll conclude this by actually just briefly talking about Richard Trevithick. As I said, he's actually one of my favorites. Standing next to the fellow who seems a wee bit camera shy here. Of course, there's no cameras, that's a joke. Richard Trevithick, Cornishman, born in Cornwall, of course, 1771. Both his father and uncle were actually engineers in the local copper mine. So by the age of 13, Trevithick was actually working in that same mine and maintaining the steam pumps in the mine. By 1800, Bolton and Watt's patents had expired, and Trevithick actually started engineering some of his own concepts with respect to steam power. Now, Bolton and Watt, of course, are famous for their steam engines, but they all operated at I won't say extremely low pressure, but relatively low pressure. Trevithick's interest was actually in high pressure steam, and of course, Bolton and Watt actually. They went to great lengths to make sure that the public was well aware that high-pressure steam posed a great danger, and it did, frankly, because it did cause some accidents at the time, as you can imagine. But Trevithick actually was instrumental in improving the safety of high-pressure boilers. So by 1801, Trevithick would actually astound the public by demonstrating a carriage that could actually move under its own power. He had developed the high-pressure steam engine to the point where it was small enough and light enough that it wouldn't burden the vehicle to the point where it couldn't actually move. As you can imagine, the Bolton and Watt engines were absolutely monstrous for this particular period of time, and Trevithick's engine was small by comparison, so giving it a power to weight ratio that was advantageous with respect to self-powered vehicles. So by the time 1804 rolls around, Trevithick has absolutely ensured his place in history by developing the world's first actual working locomotive. But unfortunately for Trevithick, it seems he can't really garner much commercial interest, and sadly he actually ends up in bankruptcy by the time 1811 rolls around. He actually, things got so sad for Trevithick, they actually had to take up the offer of working in Peru in order to mechanize a silver mine there, and he did just that. But it wouldn't be long when he got there, unrest in the country would break out, and in the location he was in anyway, where it would force him to actually flee the country. So shortly after his return to Britain, in 1833, Richard Trevithick dies in relative poverty and obscurity, which is an extremely sad statement considering the contributions to the engineering world that the man actually made. As I said, one of my favorites, Cornishman Richard Trevithick, carried to his grave just by a small party of mechanics who actually appreciated the man for what he was in his day. So yeah, that's it. So I tried to make this a wee bit quicker because I end up dragging things on and on and on a little bit too much, and I don't know if I've done Thomas Telford and John Rennie any justice there by making it so brief, but hopefully you got something out of that. And so that's part 2. So we'll carry on with another 5 or 6 fellas in part 3. Hope to see you then. Right? Cheers.